There was a recent ruling that stated that under 16s cannot consent to being given puberty blocking drugs, and the BBC reporting on it was actually quite good, and they stopped using the term transgender and have started using the more kind of psychologically appropriate gender dysphoria, which I'm quite happy about.
Right, so before we go on, can you tell people about your background, just so we can see why this is relevant?
So I've got a master's degree in psychological research methods, and I specialised in the field of decision making. It's not necessarily clinical psychology, but I've obviously learnt a fair bit about that along the way. And I did cover gender dysphoria while I was at university, and they taught it in a very different way than perhaps the media talks about it, in a far more scientific way, I suppose.
So the media, if I were to guess, talk about it in a more ideological way that's more in line with political correctness?
Yeah, essentially. In the kind of scientific community, you use the term gender dysphoria. The term transgender doesn't really get used unless it's like a colloquialism in reference to how the general public talks about it. But generally speaking, it's a definable...
and so how is it defined, just since you know all this?
So there's a couple of diagnostic manuals that clinicians use. For example, in America, I believe they use the DSM-5, which is something that's compiled by the American Psychological Association. And essentially this is what they use to diagnose people of clinical disorders. And they've essentially got the kind of transgenderism under gender dysphoria, and that's how it is viewed by psychologists, although it's very rarely framed that way.
Right, and is it viewed as a medical disorder?
Yes.
Right. And the BBC are now framing it as a medical disorder, not as an activist movement, which is the normal... I mean, I agree with you. Like, normally they use very progressive language when describing these things.
I have seen them use the word transgender many times.
Lots of times, yeah.
They've all of a sudden changed their tune with this new ruling, which seems promising at least. But anyway, I'll get onto the case. So essentially it was brought against the Tavistock and Portman NHS Trust, which is a gender identity clinic in London. It's the only one, isn't it? It's the only one. Yeah. And this case was brought by a former transgender person who changed their mind about transitioning. Their name is Kira Bell, and she said that she was delighted by the judgment, and I'll just give a bit of background on what her story is and why she would be happy about this judgment. So she visited the Tavistock Centre when she was only 16, and she was prescribed puberty blockers after only 3-hour-long meetings. So she only spoke to a psychologist for 3 hours before being prescribed these puberty blockers. And then later she was given testosterone, and then by the age of 20 she underwent a double mastectomy. So this is all stuff that cannot be reversed.
Yeah.
And
just before we go on as well, the puberty blockers, as I understand it, there are long-term consequences for these, aren't there?
Yeah, well, it messes with your biological balance, and that can't be reversed.
Yeah, but I recall reading something, there are concerns about osteoporosis, where it's like bone density is reduced and things like that in adulthood.
I haven't heard about that, but that wouldn't surprise me, because I imagine throughout puberty, I think your bone density increases, which is why it's easier for children to break bones than it is for adults.
But I recall reading something a while back about it, that this is long-term consequences. As BBC reported probably about 6 months ago, they did a Newsnight piece on it, and they just admitted that these are kind of untested drugs, and this is experimental procedures.
Well, yeah, these procedures have very little in the way of evidence to support them in their treatment, and as I'll get into later, there's actually a lot of evidence to say that they do far more harm than good, perhaps more so than any other clinical disorder in existence. Okay. And I'll provide the evidence for that claim in a second.
Let's hear it.
But I'll carry on with this case, So she realised about a year ago that she'd made a mistake about transitioning and wanted to go back, but obviously there had been permanent damage, and she argued that the clinic had essentially not challenged her motives enough, and as she was only 16 at the time, she felt like she didn't know enough about the long-term consequences to make an informed decision. And she is quoted as stating, "This judgment is not political, it's about protecting vulnerable children." So that's the rationale behind it. It's not seeking to necessarily discriminate against people, it's just about protecting the rights of children, which I think most people are for.
Yeah, looking out for their interests as they grow into adults rather than allowing... Because, I mean, you should think about it, it's a huge decision for someone who otherwise can't drink or drive to make. I mean, this is wild.
I don't think I was capable of making any responsible decisions at 16.
I can't believe we're expected to choose our careers at 16.
I know, that was difficult enough.
Yeah, I know. But anyway, sorry, I'll let you carry on.
So the sitting justices summarised their conclusions, and they said, "It is doubtful that a child aged 14 or 15 could understand and weigh the long-term risks and consequences of the administration of puberty blockers." And they also added, "In respect of young persons aged 16 and over, the legal position is that there is a presumption that they have the ability to consent to medical treatment. However, even for 16 or 17-year-olds, it may be appropriate to involve the courts in this decision. However, 18 plus are still free to use the services that are provided at the Tavistock Centre, kind of unimpeded by the courts."
See, now, to me, that just sounds like a perfectly sensible judgment.
Yeah, I see nothing wrong there at all.
Absolutely. I mean, coming from a kind of classically liberal perspective, I think you own your body. There have been cases of people who wanted to have limbs amputated, and one woman blinded herself with bleach because she just felt like she should.
Going to talk about that in a minute.
Right? Okay. Sorry, I didn't even realise. I won't try and jump ahead. But I mean, as much as I might think that that's insane, I still think that they own their bodies. It's their right to do with their person what they want, as long as they're an adult, and
of course,
that's fine.
There is still somewhat of an ethical debate there. I feel because
there is.
In the UK, we accept that sometimes people cannot be responsible to look out for their own health, particularly in cases of severe mental disorders. And
I mean, I would suggest that wanting to cut off one of your limbs that is otherwise healthy might well be a mental disorder.
Yeah,
I'm no expert.
I wouldn't encourage it.
Yeah.
I wouldn't encourage any sort of physical changes that have permanent damage potentially to you.
Yeah. Don't do anything if you don't need to do anything.
Exactly.
It's a very conservative, I guess, but common sense rule. But like I said, like adults, obviously, I think they should have the right to, if they want to do this, and they're not, they're considered to be mentally sound in other respects. Fine.
There is, of course, the argument that if it's being funded by the NHS, then maybe the general public could have a say on it. It's kind of a very grey area.
Well, you wanted the universal healthcare, now you've got it. Now we've got claims on you.
But the justices went on to say that there was a culture of unreality that has become embedded in the Tavistock Centre, and this may have led to hundreds of children receiving this experimental treatment without their properly informed consent, which I think I couldn't have put it better myself.
I mean, that's it. When you think about it, like, I whenever I talk to like people I know from other countries, especially like Eastern Europe and places like that, where they don't have political correctness, and they don't really understand the power that political correctness has on the thought processes of people in this country, they find it hard to believe that there's no way that police would let grooming gangs go on because they're afraid of being called racist. It's like, yeah, they will. There's no way that they're going to let like 13-year-olds begin gender transition surgeries and hormone treatments and whatnot because they're afraid of being called transphobic. It's like, yeah, they will. And these are things that strike me as, I mean, again, it's just a common sense position, but it doesn't look like it's going to age well, does it?
No, I mean, it is so. I don't know the word really.
It's almost callous. It's irresponsible.
Yeah,
and like with this lady, what was her name? Sorry, I can't remember her name now. But it does.
Kira Bell.
Kira Bell, yeah. In her case, she's actually had to go through it, and now she's got to live with the consequences of this forever. A double mastectomy, whatever problems come from hormone treatments that delayed her puberty. You know, these things were. I looked into the puberty blockers. They were originally sort of designed for people who had serious medical conditions, not for people who had gender dysphoria.
Yeah, there's no evidence to suggest that they're going to help anyone. No. Essentially, it's like the justices said, they're an experimental treatment. There's no evidence for it.
Yeah, and so we've been allowing radical leftists to experiment on children, and there are children now, people who have become adults now, saying this was a terrible thing and I should have been stopped, not encouraged to get on them after 3 hours of consultation. It's totally irresponsible. It's
nuts. I don't understand how any psychologist can ever approve of this. I mean, there's a very stringent ethical guideline, particularly in the UK. It's the British Psychological Society, sorry. I'm getting mixed between the American and the English one there. But they have very strict ethical guidelines that every psychologist should be made aware of and be very familiar with. So I feel like anyone who has approved this sort of thing should lose their license to practice, because they're not considering the welfare of the people they're meant to be helping.
Yeah, and it seems very ideological. You know, it seems that they've got a goal that they're trying to achieve, and they have a preset set of ideas that they're trying to fulfill, rather than looking out for the interests. But anyway, let's carry on.
Sure. So I thought I would go into gender dysphoria a little bit more and actually cover the scientific side of things, because I particularly want to look at why there is a distinction of it being a clinical disorder as opposed to how it's characterised in the media. And I've got a kind of an extract from the American Psychological Association, which is kind of the guiding light for the rest of the world a lot of the times in terms of psychological diagnosis. And they say, for a person to be diagnosed with gender dysphoria, there must be a marked difference between the individual's expressed and experienced gender and the gender others would assign him or her, and it must continue for at least 6 months. In children, the desire to be the other gender must be present and verbalised. The condition causes clinically significant distress or impairment in social, occupational, or other important areas of functioning. Gender dysphoria is manifested in a variety of ways, including strong desires to be treated as the other gender or to be rid of one's sex characteristics, or a strong conviction that one has feelings and reactions typical of the other gender. Which...
there's a lot of assumptions built into that, aren't there?
Yeah. It's the definition has been moved slightly. This is the most recent one,
right? But
it used to be a lot more objective and less focused on one's own
the
self-perception,
experiences or feelings of the person.
I think they've received an immense amount of pressure, and the APA has gone through quite a few scandals, and I think they're just trying to preserve their reputation, although a lot of practicing clinicians would probably take this definition with a pinch of salt. A lot of the clinical psychologists that I spoke to have essentially characterised it in terms that are not too unfamiliar to other clinical disorders. And
so you think there's been a political pressure from what I guess we'll just describe as the trans lobby to have the definition focused in this way rather than as a more objective one?
The APA has a really marked reputation. They've been involved in lots of scandals, and they are clearly trying to change their public perception. They don't want to undermine the whole field of psychology simply for some terminology and wording, I think. But I'm going to go on to some more statistics here, and these are taken from Stonewall, which
there's an LGBTQIA plus charity,
and even they term things in quite unfavourable ways, should I say. So they say that almost half, or 48%, of trans people in Britain have attempted suicide at least once. 84% have at least thought about it, and more than half, 55%, have been diagnosed with depression at some point. And they are advocating for trans rights, and this is what they have
These
on their
are their
website.
Statistics.
Yeah. This was from a sample of 889 people, which is quite a lot by any measure, really.
Yeah.
And outside of that, in the more scientific research, there was a recent 2019 study in the US in spanning 10 different states that found that 34.6% of transgender youths have attempted suicide in the past 12 months, which is far higher than lesbian, gay and bisexuals, which place slightly above the average.
Right, okay.
So it's suggesting that these are extremely vulnerable people, and they have rates of attempted suicide that are unparalleled in society anywhere, even in conditions that are as severe as schizophrenia. It's like 3 times higher, and that is like that's like the number one debilitating kind of psychological disorder.
Yeah, and we're giving ideological zealots access to these people. I mean, I don't want to overstate the case, but I don't think I am when I say
that's perfectly reasonable claim. The courts would agree with you.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, as the legal judgment suggests, these people should probably be protected from the activists.
Absolutely, yeah. And there was an even better study than this, which really went to demonstrate this point. It was a 30-year longitudinal study in Sweden, which found that those with gender dysphoria were 19 times more likely to attempt suicide and had a 3 times higher mortality rate overall than the general population. So that would be unintentional deaths as well, which were largely linked to drug abuse, which I believe...
much higher risk of,
I think it's about 20% higher than the general population.
So when you start saying it's like depression and other mental disorders, you get a cluster of behaviours around that, don't you? That are fairly predictable. I mean, I've known people with depression who fall into similar sort of patterns of behaviour. I mean, this is just my own experience, but I think it's probably something common, isn't it?
Yeah, and in gender dysphoria, there's something known as a comorbid conditions, and they're essentially conditions that co-occur with gender dysphoria, and one of the main ones which provide a good rationale that it is its own distinct clinical disorder is that it co-occurs with body integrity identity disorder in about 19% of cases, which is a disorder where you feel like a part of your body should not be a part of your body, which ties into the woman who blinded herself with drain cleaner in 2015 because she said she always dreamed of being disabled, and she said, I should have been blind from birth. And if you could...
Jesus.
Oh, you've brought up the article already. You can see her there with her self-inflicted blindness, and I would like to point out that she conspired with a psychologist to do this, and her psychologist used drain cleaner to blind her, which is horrific.
How, as someone who is, I guess we'd call a psychologist yourself, how do you feel about the psychologist she was working with?
Mortified, because it demeans our entire
profession.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, we're going to work with you to help you blind yourself with drain cleaner. I mean, that is wild. That's wild. There's always someone who has it worse than you, I think, is the lesson we can take away from this.
Yeah, definitely. I mean...
Jesus.
I don't understand how they could ever justify that other than they're just trying to reaffirm people's own delusions to themselves, which is really harmful. And
so I've got a question. I never see it raised. I see it raised often that people will say, well, I was born in the wrong body, and therefore I have to change my body to fit my perception of myself, as if the will is some sort of separate entity to the body. But obviously the will is a property of the body. It's a construct of your brain, which is a biological organ, which is influenced by your hormones. And I mean, I assume that there's some sort of hormone imbalance or excess of sort of testosterone or something like that with, women who feel like they're men and then transition to become men. Why is it never suggested that they're just given doses of the hormone that suits their gender?
Because the systems are far more complex, and we've tried that. Not me specifically. Psychologists have tried that.
Okay, doctor. man. So go on.
So they've tried it, and there were suggestions that it worked in some rare cases where essentially they gave someone a pill which was meant to correct their hormonal imbalance, and it did work in one case, but then in 34 others it didn't.
Right.
So it could just be that, it's environmental factors rather than the actual biological, because it's very difficult in human beings to attribute anything to the actual treatment, because human beings are
complex things that have lots of forces pulling on them all times. Is there anything else we need to know?
No, I don't think so. I think I've covered the majority of it there.
So the ruling then is going to mean that people under 16, was it? Won't be able to have any kind of transitionary surgery or treatments.
That's right. They are viewed as not being able to consent, and therefore, if they are to at all, it would have to be at 16, and they would have to get court involvement to rule on the case before they go to the Tavistock Centre.
This is going to be a weird question, but what's been the Pink News response to this?
Well, they're crying murder, aren't they?
I guess they must be, yeah.
They think it's awful, and that it's essentially transphobia.
Of course it is.
Encoded into our legal system. But
yes. So I think we can chalk this up as a win for common sense.
I'd say so.
And a win for people who don't want to be manipulated by radical ideologues who think that you should be able to manipulate a child's body in this way long before they're able to give consent to anything else in life. So thank God, something sensible at last.